why was it that for so long conservatives and corporations come together? And I think it's largely historical. There's a good reason for it. I think we should just ignore that that there was like some sort of not symbiotic relationship in some sense. The reality was the Cold War, right? The reality was the Cold War, and the idea was that the real threat to liberty was the state, was the government. It was socialism, it was communism, and with respect to that, corporations were basically on the right side of the issue. They were on the stand. The idea was big institutions like corporations might have the power, might have the ability to stand up to big government and stand up to socialism and the like. And at that point, corporations were a lot different from they are today. I mean, think back to Ronald Reagan became famous because General Electric sent him out around the country to talk about freedom, to talk about capitalism, to talk about Americanism. And so we just had a very different corporate culture at that time. Whereas now, as Jonathan Berry mentioned, that's not the culture we have today, which is corporate CEOs today share the same elite values as everybody else, right? All the elite values, right? I was thinking about somebody who told me once he was a CEO or a senior manager at a Midwestern big corporation. It was traditionally quite conservative. And I said, why is your company doing all these things you do? And he said, well, it's because they see their constituency as their Harvard Business School classmates. They're embarrassed that they're out here running a company making stuff while their Silicon Valley buddies and their Wall Street buddies are out, doing cool stuff. And so this is their way of saying, I'm just as cool as you. I can get a good table at Davos as well. And so they exert their energy on things like bathrooms, voter laws, and that sort of thing. So what we've seen over time is a difference in what corporations are doing. And I think this is important to understand as well, which is traditionally what did corporations do when they sort of did non-business things? They did two things, really. They kind of did anodyne, non-controversial things like sponsoring the local Little League, right? Or having an employee picnic at Six Flags, or doing things for schools and that sort of thing. It's sort of providing public goods in some sense. The other thing they did were things that were basically consistent with maximizing shareholder value, which is they basically engaged in rent seeking. But everybody understood this, right? Exxon wasn't claiming that they were somehow holy and mighty when they were lobbying for oil subsidies, right? Or farmers or whatever, right? Everybody understood what was up. It was very transparent. And it was perfectly consistent with shareholder value, whether you like it or not. What they're doing today, though, is specifically weighing in on the most divisive issues in society on one side and using their economic leverage to try to override the political system and impose their views on the democratic system. And if you just look at what happened with Florida, you see exactly what's going on. So Disney's not even a Florida company, right? It's a California company. And all these other companies that Jonathan mentioned are going to dictate to a state that they don't even live in what their policy should be on these sorts of things. That is very different from the things that corporations used to do in the past. And now we've seen this accelerate over time. Just look at, obviously, the COVID experience, right? What do we see during COVID? Well, I'm here to say I was sent, some of you may know, I sued my employer for the COVID vaccine mandate because I already had COVID before. What did I read from that? I got a couple of videos removed from YouTube for talking about natural immunity. As far as I can tell, I'm still shadow banned on Facebook. There's no way to find out for sure whether you're shadow banned on Facebook. Right, doctors who I followed disappeared from Twitter. It's come out now that Amazon was essentially banning books, manipulating search results so you couldn't find books that didn't meet the approval. I testified a few weeks ago in Congress on the censorship operation in Congressman Jordan's special subcommittee on weaponization. And it came out during that, the White House didn't even care. They talked about misinformation. Misinformation was not the test. They didn't care whether what people were saying was true or not. What they cared about was whether or not it promoted vaccine hesitancy, even if it was true information. They weren't suppressing misinformation, disinformation. They were suppressing politically inconvenient, or trying to suppress it. So I should say try, because I guess I need to congratulate all the corporations, because under Murphy versus Missouri, apparently it turns out everything that happened to me was the result of YouTube and Google and Facebook and all these sorts of guys. And never have I felt so free as the day that I discovered I was filled with freedom. When I realized, thank goodness, it's some mid-level bureaucrat at YouTube who decided that I shouldn't be allowed to speak and libel me by spreading misinformation in lie, right? So congratulations to the book banners, to the speech censors and that sort of thing. You get full responsibility. You get full credit for your achievements during this period, right? So how do we get here? How do we get from A to B? And I'll just sort of tell my experience of my awakening, because my topic was the Mozilla moment, which is a pivotal thing in this. If you go back to the Obama administration, I would remind you of something called Operation Choke Point, which some of you may be familiar with. Operation Choke Point was an operation which used the banking regulators to lean on banks to debank certain industries. And what's interesting about this is everybody focused on payday lenders, which you can't focus because it's a perfectly legal business that they were using the regulatory state guidance to get. But what's also interesting, who else is on that list? Firearms dealers, ammunition dealers, so-called sellers of so-called racist materials, right? These are constitutionally protected things, right? Whether you like it or not, racist materials are protected by the First Amendment. Guns are protected by the Second Amendment, right? And this idiotic decision that the Supreme Court just had in Murphy that doesn't understand the way in which the modern regulatory state works, I think is going to just encourage that sort of behavior, right? So when I saw that, I was like, okay, I don't have to fundamentally change my worldview. They were doing this because the government was leading on it. And that's why Mozilla then becomes an important thing. And how many here remember Brendan Ike and Mozilla? Right? So what happened, just to refresh your memory, was he basically invented the Mozilla browser, became president of, they named him CEO of Mozilla, and the employees went into a tizzy. Why? Because he had donated like $100 or something to the referendum for the initiative for traditional marriage in California. And everybody blew a gasket, and eventually they forced him to resign, right? He's landed on his feet. He now is running the Brave browser. But when I saw that, people say, well, how did you know 10 years ago in 2014 that that was significant? And the reason is, when I looked at that, I said two things to myself. First, this is exactly how it started in the universities. And what we've seen is corporations that followed exactly the same trajectory as universities a generation before, which is they get their foot in the door, and then it just rolls forward and becomes more and more extreme. And what was the second thing was obvious. The idea that you can't donate to a traditional marriage initiative is not an equilibrium point. If you can't donate, then are you allowed to vote for it? Are you required to vote against it to be the CEO? Are you required as part of your job interview to answer the question, how did you vote on it? Are you required to donate against it in order to be CEO of a company, right? Because that's also what they've done in the universities, which they haven't just allowed toleration, they haven't just allowed people to hold views that they don't have. You have to affirmatively agree with the agenda. You have to affirmatively agree with this. And the corporations basically gave themselves up to this. And it started with Mozilla, and it's progressed. You know, as I say, it always, and they call me Nazi, right, for sure. But what they always say is, well, surely you wouldn't allow a Nazi on your campus, would you? Well, no, it starts with the Nazis, but it never ends with the Nazis. Right? It starts with the Nazis, then it's Ann Coulter, and pretty soon George Will is being on the campus, right? And that's kind of where we're at right now with a lot of these things. So let me bring in the ship here and think about where we're landing here. So what do we think about in terms of solutions? Well, the first thing I want to say, we've thought of this for good reasons as a corporate governance issue. I could say it certainly is to some extent a corporate governance issue. God bless Ron Barry and the people who are fighting this. But I'm not sure that thinking of it as corporate governance issue is kind of like that's, the hammer and nail sort of thing. What's really going on here is not so much a corporate governance issue, but it's a democracy issue. It's an issue of democracy, of big corporations thinking that they should be able to dictate to the voters what their policies should be. Right? That's the problem with Disney. So if all of a sudden Disney shareholders said, we're passing a resolution, we're going to all accept 4 cents less on a dividend to stick it to DeSantis, right? Number one, I could imagine that passing. I could imagine Disney shareholders, and once you've done the institutional shareholders, I could imagine that happening. Does that mean I'd be okay with that? Well, no. The problem is not, I think, that the shareholders haven't authorized it. It's that the corporation shouldn't be doing it. They shouldn't be doing it because I think it's a danger to the democratic process. So I think it's a democracy problem for that corporate governance issue. And so, as I close here, what I think is, now how do we roll this back? How do we get from things here? I would say my goal, my vision for society is that most of society should be non-political. We should be able to go to work and not have to worry about, wearing the ribbon or whatever it is we're supposed to do. We should be able to go to a football game and not have to deal with this. We should be able to go, most of our lives should be non-political, and especially our work. We live under a system of democratic capitalism. You should be able to express yourself in the public sphere without that leading to economic suicide, right, or economic destruction. And you should be able to, I think, earn a living without having to endorse certain sorts of political views. How do we get from here to there? The best I've been able to come up with is some version of tit for tat, which is they've gotten a free pass for a long time on this stuff. They're all of a sudden waking up and realizing they don't have a free pass. I just crocodile tears for them. Now, every time they're complaining, they're conservative. How do we deal with both of these things at once, right? It's like, well, you should have thought about that. You were warned about that, and you just decided you didn't want to deal with it. The last thing I'll say is, and maybe we can talk about this in the discussion, we do need to be careful about unintended consequences. That some of the ideas that are out there that we can talk about, I think are more complicated in the real world and might have counterproductive results. And if you look at universities, for example, a lot of the problems we have in universities today are unintended consequences of trying to fix problems in the past. These are very complex systems, and so I think we'll hopefully have an open dialogue and debate on how to best solve them. Thanks.